This is the Chopped Podcast, episode number 9. Whoa. Hey everyone, I'm Marley of the blog Namely Marley. Thanks for joining me today. This is the 9th episode of the Chopped Podcast, the podcast designed for people just like you, bloggers who love food. Each week I'm sharing stories, thoughts, interviews, everything related to food blogging so we can all learn together what works and a little bit about what doesn't. Today's guest is Mark Leonard of the law firm Davis & Leonard. If you find discussions related to copyright and trademark law, let's say more boring than a drive through Kansas in July, then I want you to know I get you. When you've got food photos to edit, content to write, and an Instagram feed to respond to, worrying about copyright and trademark issues for your blog just kind of gets bumped further and further down the list. You think, I'm going to do that next month when things feel more normal. But here's the deal. I'm beginning to learn this the hard way, but I don't really think there's anything normal about food blogging. I don't think we actually ever arrived at that spot that's called normal. In fact, crazy is the new normal for food bloggers. I think that might need to be a t-shirt or something. I'm going to call Mark and see if I can get him to trademark that. Just kidding. But you guys get my point, right? Sometimes this stuff isn't terribly exciting, but that doesn't mean it's any less important. And Mark is great. He's personable, and some of his clients are food bloggers. So, that means he really gets it. And also, he's a foodie. We got to give him some bonus points for that, I think. You're going to love listening to the end of the interview. He talks about some of his favorite online sources, and you're going to recognize some really great food bloggers in there. So let's break it down a little. Mark and I talk specifically about the differences between copyright, trademark, and intellectual property. There's some important distinctions between those three areas, and I think he does a really great job of explaining that. We also talk about things that small businesses like food blogs need to be looking out for on a day-to-day basis. Things like, let's say you decide to do a site redesign and you have a contract with a website designer. Mark talks about the important things you might want to look for in a contract like that to make sure that your bases are covered. We also talk about the things that you can go through the process for trademarking your own domain name. So I love how he kind of spells out the steps that are involved with that. This is a complicated topic, so I actually created a little handy guide. It's just a short informational piece that you can download at the show notes page. So just head over to chopcon.com if you want to learn more about that. Let's go straight to the interview with Mark. Today's intro is in honor of Cheryl Suzanne of Tidy Mom, who recently posted on Instagram how she listens to the Chop podcast while she's editing photos. What a great idea. You've got to see her photo, so I'm going to leave a link in the show notes page. If you want to share the fun ways you're listening to the Chop podcast, send me a photo on Instagram using the hashtag ChoppedCon, and maybe I'll feature you in a future episode too. So, in honor of Cheryl, fire up your monitor, load up those images, put on those awesome noise-reducing headphones, and let's talk about all things food blogging and so much more. Hey everyone, I'm excited to have Mark Leonard, co-founder of the law firm Davis & Leonard, on the show today. Mark, welcome to the Chopped Podcast.
Thank you, Marley. Excited to be here.
Great. I'm so glad that you've taken the time. I know that you've got a really busy schedule. I'm so glad that you're talking with me today. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you, believe it or not, about all things law, related to food blogging. And I know that you specialize in things like copywriting and intellectual property and all that stuff. Intellectual property, I'm sorry. So I'm really looking forward to talking with that. But first, let's talk a little bit about how you got your start and how you ended up right where you're at.
Sure. Well, I was fortunate in that when I decided to go to law school, I wanted to practice intellectual property law. It was always fascinating to me because unlike some other areas of law, it's constantly changing, and it's constantly being impacted by new technologies. So actually watching the law develop, as an attorney is very interesting. And there's also a lot of confusion about it. It affects, any business that you can imagine. Bloggers, everyone has intellectual property issues, whether they know it or not. So to the extent that I can help to eliminate some confusion, it's always a fun area to work in with new clients and new people.
That's great. So you've been interested in intellectual. I heard this statement that you like to watch the law evolve, and that sounds kind of interesting to me. It seems like a slow process, or maybe it's not.
Sometimes it can be. Sometimes it's legislative fixes that are necessary. Sometimes a new technology, it takes an older aspect of law like copyright and does things with it that nobody expected. So the other times it's a matter of a new issue in front of a judge, and that judge is making a decision, and then we have the decisional law from that. Sometimes they make the right one, sometimes they don't,
Right.
and you can get into situations, and this is pretty common, where different courts in different areas of the country address the same issue differently. So depending on where you're at and where your client's at, you really have to keep abreast of what's happening throughout the U.S. to see how these issues are being treated and to give your client the best advice possible.
I think it's such an important topic, especially as we're, transitioning to talking about this for food bloggers. But, if you look at food bloggers as people who are starting or already have their own small business, it seems like intellectual property is something that is easily overlooked, but really important.
Absolutely, and it's really for all new businesses, but especially if you're in an online space like with food blogging, there are constantly copyright and trademark issues that are coming up that you may not be aware of until you have a problem.
That's right, and it could be also partnership issues. Like if you decide to start your blog with somebody else, and you don't have these really important discussions about who owns what and who's contributing what ahead of time, it can really lead to problems.
Absolutely, it's one of the most common problems with new businesses, especially in the blogging situation. Not just with partnerships, but even if you're not coding your own site, for example, and you hire a web developer, and it could be somebody just a friend of yours, or it's a handshake deal, and lo and behold, you find out months, years later that the developer is claiming ownership in your site code, and is not allowing you to go off and work with a new developer because they're claiming that you only have a license, that you don't own it.
Wow.
One of the number one issues for small businesses generally is disputes with their website development companies, and not addressing these issues when that business relationship starts.
Really? Wow, that is so. I mean, if you can imagine, if you've developed this huge blog and then you find out there's this ownership issue, that would be really, scary.
Exactly, and that's one of the the copyright issues that comes up. People assume that if I hire you to design something for me, be it a blog, be it contributions to a cookbook, photography, to go up on your blog, the law, the standard is that the person hiring is not the owner. They merely have permission to use it, and so if you do want ownership, that arrangement needs to be worked out ahead of time. Or if you want a very broad permission to continue to use it, so that if something happens to the relationship with your developer, photographer, or whoever it may be, that you still have the right to use those images or that site code in the future.
And I think it'd probably be important to clarify ahead of the rest of the discussion, that none of this is meant to scare anybody. It's really meant to be a part of the information that you have on hand to make sure that you're making the best decisions possible.
No, exactly. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
make people question their entire business model or anything else, but to educate people.
Right.
I represent a number of food bloggers. I see these issues, and it's just like anything else in business. If you know about these issues, if you get educated about them, when they do come up, that you can address them.
Right. So the sooner you can become informed, the sooner you make decisions as a business owner, probably the better.
Exactly.
So the primary audience of this podcast is food bloggers, and a lot of the food bloggers that I've talked with, they all have the same question: should I register the trademark for my site's name?
The answer to that question is almost always yes. What a trademark registration gives you, there's a lot of misconception about this, and not just in the food blogging world, but generally. Just because you can obtain a particular domain name from a registrar, that doesn't mean that there's any kind of trademark search that has gone on. that there's any kind of trademark clearance. It even extends to getting, let's say you get to the point where you want to start a business entity, and you apply to the Secretary of State in your state, and they say, yes, you can have this name. There's no trademark clearance going on there either. And so even though you can get that domain, even though you can get that business name, it could potentially be infringing somebody else's trademark. And so one of the advantages of seeking registration is to do a search to register that with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. It is possible to get state registrations as well, but the federal registration is really what's most helpful because it gives you a nationwide right to use your trademark, to use your blog name.
Wow, that's interesting. I never thought about it from that perspective, that just because the domain name is available and just because you're able to even, the name is available in your state to register as an LLC, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the trademark is available.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. So it's more than going to name.com and searching to see if the name is available. It's also about, why not go ahead and find out if the trademark is available as well.
Right, and that can be somewhat of a complicated process because the standard for trademark conflicts is that the marks be confusingly similar and that the services or goods offered in connection with the trademarks be related in some way. So if you find that you're out there, you're thinking of a new blog name, and you find that somebody is using it, but they're using it in connection with an auto parts store or something unrelated to food blogging especially, that's not going to be a trademark conflict because the services that you're offering, food blogging, versus an online auto parts store are not related. People aren't going to expect the same company is going to be offering both of those services. Where it gets a little trickier is, well, let's say it's not a food-related blog, but they're blogging about sports or they're blogging about entertainment. Is that necessarily a conflict? This is where this isn't rocket scientist, and it's certainly not a commercial for myself or for trademark attorneys generally, but that's the advantage of working with a trademark attorney to evaluate the search and to determine are these going to be potential conflicts or not, and they can give you direction on that. But a lot of the legwork you as a food blogger can do yourself. Get out there and search, see what domains are available. The space. What other food bloggers are using something similar perhaps. There are a lot of descriptive terms that are used in connection with food blogging. Kitchen, cooking. A lot of these terms end up in the name of the blog. And those are what we call descriptive terms that you can't claim rights in them apart from the mark itself. So if you were going to start your own blog, food blog, Marley's Kitchen, as long as, the fact that there might be, Mary's Kitchen already out there as a food blog probably isn't going to be a problem because, kitchen is one of those descriptive terms as applied to cooking, and so you wouldn't be able to claim exclusive rights in it.
I see. That makes sense. So it sounds to me like you kind of like working with clients that have done a little bit of the legwork ahead of time.
It does. It makes my job a little bit easier to say, okay, well, I'm not an expert in your industry, whatever it be, food blogging or biotech or anything. So tell me about who else is out there. What kind of terms are common with business names in that particular industry. And, sometimes they come back to me and they say, oh, well, I've already done the internet search. You don't need to do any searching on this. I said, well, it doesn't exactly work that way because even if your business is in the online space, that doesn't mean potentially conflicting trademarks are necessarily always going to be in the online space. And so we want to go a little deeper with our searches.
Oh, that's great. So let's go into a little business law 101. Can you briefly explain the differences between copyrights, trademarks, and intellectual property?
Great question. There's a lot of confusion about this. Intellectual property generally is just a description for different areas of intangible property. Intangible property is property that you have rights in, but unlike physical property, it doesn't physically exist. So there are different subsets of intellectual property. Copyright is one, trademark is another, e-commerce is one that's considered trade secret, and patent are some of the main areas. And then there's some subdivisions in there. But the biggest difference between trademark and copyright, and where there's a lot of confusion, is you can have your business name is your trademark. You can't copyright short phrases, for example. And so if you were going to seek to protect your business name, you would be seeking a trademark registration for it. You would not be seeking to copyright it. Now, the content on your site, photos, the text, that is potentially protectable under copyright. And there can be some overlap. So you can come up with, for example, with a very stylized logo for your blog name, and it can contain enough design elements that you could potentially seek copyright protection for it. And you can do that. You would just, if you wanted to register that copyright, you register it with the U.S. Copyright Office, and you have that registration now regardless of what you do with that image. The difference between that and trademark is you could do the same thing. You could potentially seek a trademark registration for your logo. But the difference with trademark is that the trademark rights only exist as long as the service or product is being offered in connection with that trademark. So you register it, but every between the 5th and 6th year, and then between the 9th and 10th year, and every 10 years after that, you have to renew that trademark registration. You have to show the trademark office that, yes, I am still continuing to offer this service in connection with this image, this logo. You don't have that with copyright. And then, like I said before, you can't copyright short phrases. There are certain things that are not registrable under copyright. There are certain things that are not registrable under trademark. But generally, the way to think about it is, if it's a short name, a phrase, you're talking about trademark. If you're talking about something more extensive, more artistic, certainly with photographs, you're talking about potential copyright protection.
Okay, great. And I heard somebody say the other day that if you've gone to the trouble and you have a trademark, it's really your responsibility to defend that trademark. Is that right?
There's a lot of confusion on this issue too. People think, well, I don't need to register my trademark because I'm not going to run around and try to go after every little infringer or somebody who I think is being infringing. Most of my clients actually get trademark registrations for the defensive benefits. And what that means is, if you get a federal trademark registration for your mark, and somebody begins using a similar term after that fact, while you do have the ability to get them to stop using it, it's more of a defensive benefit in that that person who came later can't make you stop using your trademark. So even if you're not constantly monitoring and looking to see what other people might be doing to see if they're already infringers, it's a little bit of peace of mind that somebody, perhaps bigger, perhaps a big company with more resources isn't going to come along later and say, you have to change your name or you have to stop using your name because now we're using something that's too similar. By having that trademark registration in place, again, federal registration, it gives nationwide constructive notice to anybody who might want to adopt a confusingly similar mark that you are the prior owner of that, and they do so at their peril.
Interesting. So some big brand could come along and take up if you don't have your name trademarked, and they could take up a similar name and actually ask you to stop using yours because you don't have it trademarked. You don't have any precedent for keeping it, right?
Yeah, the way it works is you don't need to register your trademark to acquire trademark rights. Okay. So you start blogging under a particular name, you have trademark rights in that name. The question is, are your rights superior to anyone else's? And that's where the registration is so helpful. So if you didn't register and somebody came along later and adopted a confusingly similar mark, we define the scope of your rights as to your market as it existed at the time that they got their federal trademark registration. That can be obviously a little tricky to do on the internet, but you would look to, okay, well, where are, if people, you have comments featured on your blog, where are people from that are commenting? If you have, maybe you're part of an affiliate program, maybe you're getting AdWords revenue. looking at the scope of your geographic market, and it can be kind of a mess, and it can be kind of expensive if you have to go into this big analysis of, well, who was in what space, where was the market, and you eliminate all of that hassle by having the federal trademark registration in place. And so that's why we recommend them.
So let's say that we've got somebody listening right now who's very interested in getting their site name trademarked. What are the steps involved in doing that?
Well, the first one, the Patent and Trademark Office actually offers a lot of good resources for self-help, and that's uspto.gov. And if you go to the trademark section, and they have some great videos, they have some great FAQs on things to look for. And while it is possible to do this application process yourself, you can get into some technical issues, especially like I talked about before, trying to evaluate when you find another trademark out there that might be similar, whether or not it's too similar. Am I going to the risk is that you don't talk to a trademark attorney, you proceed, you didn't think that this trademark was a potential conflict, even if you knew about it ahead of time. Let's say you did your own search. They do offer their search capabilities through the USPTO site. There's no refund from the USPTO. So if you applied it to register your trademark, the filing fees vary between $225 and $325, depending on the mark that you're applying for, the services that you're applying for. And the Patent and Trademark Office comes back and says, nope, your application is in conflict with a pending application or an existing registration. You're out that money. If you can't get around that conflict, then they don't refund your application filing fee. So you can, be penny wise and pound foolish by trying to do too much of this yourself, but certainly a lot of it you can do ahead of time. And then talk to a trademark attorney and say, here's what I found so far. What do you think? You should be able to find an attorney that will just offer some consultation on that at a reasonable price.
So then the nice thing about that is that you've got this relationship built with this attorney that can help you if there was a situation where you had to defend that lawsuit as well.
Right.
Or not lawsuit, defend that trademark, yeah.
Getting through the application process, again, it's not rocket science, but it's like anything else. There's some technical issues that are unique to the application process, and having somebody who's experienced in that can make it go much, much better. Similarly, there's a lot of companies and services out there that offer, flat fee trademarks. They're not law firms, talking about, LegalZoom and places like that. It can certainly, from a price standpoint, I can understand it's certainly attractive, but they're not attorneys. They can't offer legal advice.
I see.
So they may provide you with a very comprehensive, impressive-looking search report that's several hundred pages, but they can't tell you if any of the marks in the search are actually in conflict or not.
I see. That's kind of left up to you to do, yeah.
Exactly, and now you're back to, well, how do I interpret this? I don't know trademark law. I don't know if this huge report means that I can't get this trademark registration through because there's so many other, there's all these hits in this report.
Right. If a site has a couple of different things that they're doing, do they just, like, for example, you mentioned the example, like, let's talk about Marley's Kitchen. If I also had Marley's Kitchen cookbook or whatever, and I wanted to trademark those all together, is that something I could do it in a group, or you have to kind of do them each individually?
It's a great question. This is another distinction between trademarks and copyrights. You get your copyright, that's it. You have a copyright in a particular image. With trademarks, your rights extend only to those goods and services that you're actually offering in connection with your mark. So, for example, if you start the trademark application process, one of the initial questions is, in what class do you want to register? What that means is, the USPTO has divided up all products and services into 45 different classes. And so, for example, if you are blogging, you're probably going to be in class 42, offering a website, or a blog featuring blank. And the blank is whatever the subject matter of the blog is. But let's say you're also you're selling your own, let's say a clothing line or cookbooks from your site. Well, now you're in online retail services in class 35. and those products themselves have their own class. So cookbooks would be in class 16, clothing items would be in class 25. And so you can do that all at once if you're actually offering all of those things at the same time, or as you start adding those new products or new services. Let's say it just starts out as a regular food blog, but then a year later you've got now online retail services, or you've got a cookbook available. You can't go back and add to your registration, assuming you got it for the blog ahead of time, but you can file a new application for those new products, those new services.
It's kind of like an add-on to the original application?
It would be a separate application and a separate registration. So you can end up having the 5 different registrations, all for the same trademark, because they all cover different products or services.
I see. Okay. So let's say there's a food blogger that gets a sweet deal from a brand. This is a little bit, different than what we were just talking about, but sweet deal from a brand to do some sponsored posts. That usually comes with a contract. Why should a food blogger think about having an attorney review that contract?
It's always helpful to have somebody who is, familiar with contracts specifically, but especially somebody who is used to working in the online space, to just even quickly look over it. And we're not talking about, in most cases, these contracts are fairly brief. To see, there can be provisions that may not be immediately apparent as to what their impact is. So, for example, if you're promoting a particular company's product and maybe even offering it for sale from your site, and that company is accused of trademark infringement, you can potentially be liable for it as well. And you want to have indemnification provision in that agreement with that company that if something like that were to happen, they're going to be responsible for any claims of infringement by third parties against you.
That's what that indemnification clause is about. Like, your business is your business and mine is mine.
Right.
Yeah.
In general, indemnification clauses provide for the defense of one of the parties in the contract based on something that the other party did.
I see.
And
Okay.
You want to try to see those. Now, that's not a common situation, may never actually come up, but seeing whether or not it's actually in the agreement. In some cases, contracts might be very onerous as to they're claiming, for example, might be claiming copyright in your posts. That any promotion or marketing materials that you develop around this product, they may claim ownership in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something you would want to see, whether or not that's in that agreement.
Ownership, I think, is a really important thing to consider, because you want to know who's going to own that. If you create a blog post for some brand, you want to know who's going to own that, that recipe and the photos after it's done.
Absolutely. Right. If you've gone out and you've done your own photography, like a lot of food bloggers do, you want to make sure that you're retaining ownership of that. Maybe they want to use that photo in their own marketing, and that can be a fantastic thing because you can get promotion for your blog. But you also want to make sure that you're not giving up the store in the sense that you're giving away ownership of that, and instead that you're providing just a license for them to use it, but that you retain it so that you're the actual owner of the copyright in that photo.
Yeah, exactly. And exclusivity is another thing that I've seen that can be an issue in those contracts, and that is a lot of times these brands will want you to exclusively work with their brand and not a competing brand for a certain period of time.
Right, and you can be that can run into problems when you've got a particular brand of sriracha that you've
I
always
love sriracha.
Who doesn't, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing stuff. But you get approached for a different brand, and they say, you can't talk about other brands of sriracha, and you may not even think about it because your recipes that you've been posting about, maybe even for years, have always referred to this other brand, and going forward now for whatever the period of exclusivity is in the agreement, you can't talk about that. And depending on the nature of that relationship with the company that's offering their product to you to promote, it can trigger disclosure requirements as well with the Federal Trade Commission. So if you're receiving that product for free from the manufacturer to write about it, that's something that needs to be disclosed in any of your posts about that product.
That's right. And it seems to me like a lot of brands are very aware of that, and they're including that in their contracts as well as like the kind of language they want to see in the post.
Right, and it's just good practice.
Mm-hmm.
Your readers want to know that you're being honest and that you disclose, hey, I'm raving about this particular beer or sriracha or whatever it is. By the way, wanted to let you know they gave it to me for free, or I got a discount on it, or whatever. It just increases credibility with your readers. So it's not only is it required under FTC regulations, it's just good blogging practices as well.
Exactly. And now you've raised a really good point, and that is, where is beer-flavored sriracha or sriracha-flavored beer?
I'm sure coming to a test market soon.
I'm sure. If they've got a flavored potato chips, it's got to be coming to beer, I think.
Exactly.
So speaking of copyright and ownership of your content, I've heard a lot of food bloggers say that the recipe itself cannot be copyrighted, but the instructions, like as far as the list of ingredients, that cannot be copyrighted, but the instructions for a recipe can be. Do you think that's true?
That's generally accurate. There are certain exclusions from copyright. We talked about short phrases before.
Mm-hmm.
Methods, processes, or systems, and recipes fall under that category. So while the recipe itself you can't obtain copyrights in it, the instructions could be, particularly if you've added in, more about your process of, here's what I was doing when I was going through this, maybe throwing in an anecdote about this was a dish that you made with your grandmother. To the extent that there's more exposition in the instructions as just very cut and dry, makes those instructions potentially more protectable under copyright, and as well as the overall layout and order and selection of your recipes. This is something that comes up a lot with, and this is why you can have a copyright registration for a cookbook, even though the individual recipes within it are not protectable under copyright. Even putting aside the photos and everything else, the selection and arrangement of otherwise uncopyrightable material overall can be subject to copyright. So your site itself, you may want to seek copyright registration for that, and you will have some copyright protection if somebody were to infringe it, even if they are just taking part of the recipe because they've infringed the overall copyright in your collective work or the blog itself.
That's great. This conversation feels interesting to me because it almost begins to touch on SEO, and it almost begins, here in a minute I'm going to ask you a question about the legal entity of a blog, and it makes me think, it's like it starts to delve into lots of different areas.
It does. It like a lot of online businesses, it touches on so many different aspects of law, not just intellectual property. And so there is a lot to keep in mind as you're in this space that you may be thinking, oh, I'm just blogging about baking. I'm not really I'm not a major online business. I don't need to think about these things, but you do. You've got a trademark in your blog name. You've got copyright ownership of your photographs, and so these issues do come up regardless of whether you're just starting out or whether you're a very successful commercial food blog.
You raised a question something that I want to run by you. You mentioned that let's say a site is trademarked. They have their site name registered and it's got the trademark approval. Does that necessarily mean that the content is also copyrighted on that blog?
No, and it absolutely does not. Again, because there are differences between trademark and copyright. So you have a trademark registration for your blog name, that's only extending to that name. Any of the content on your site is going to be potentially subject to copyright. And so to protect the content, you want to seek a copyright registration for your site. And that it's a very frustrating thing for food bloggers, and this goes back to one of the areas where copyright hasn't really caught up with the technology yet, because you have to, let's say your site's been up for a year, you register all that content. You post a new comment or post the following week. Well, that new post isn't covered in your existing copyright, you would potentially have to register it again with the new content in order to get protection for it. And obviously that can become a very expensive process. The filing fees are relatively low for copyright registrations. If you meet certain criteria, it's $35. Otherwise, it goes up to $55. But it's one of the common questions I get from my food blogging clients is, how frequently do I register my site? And there's not a great answer for that, unfortunately. After maybe quarterly, or maybe once a year, you seek a new registration to protect the content that you've added since the last time that you applied for your copyright registration.
But it's an iterative process. It's something bloggers should be prepared to do over and over, at least for now.
Exactly. We're hoping to see. So, for example, there's some exceptions made for magazines and other serial publications, so that they're not having to register the entire work, multiple times. Those accommodations don't extend yet to blogs, and so that's something where we would like to see some action from the Copyright Office on, to allow for a more economical way to submit your updated content and get copyright protection for it.
Great. So we've talked about copyright, we've talked about sponsored post contracts, and we've talked about trademarks. Are there other legal implications that you think food bloggers should be considering? I mean, for example, should food bloggers have some kind of general liability insurance, you think?
That's really a question to look at closely with your agent or broker. A lot of commercial liability policies have specific exclusions for intellectual property coverage, or you might have to have a specific rider added to the policy to cover for, in the insurance speak, it's often called advertising injury, and that's where usually you're talking about trademark infringement there. Sometimes there might also be coverage for copyright. If you're getting to that point that you're concerned about it, maybe your blog is really taking off, it's become financially successful, that's certainly a conversation to have with an agent or broker, and also to be thinking about, well, do I form a business entity now?
Right.
I started this off as just myself in front of my computer, and now it's become an actual business, maybe even to the point where you're looking at doing it full time. The advantage of a business entity, like a limited liability company or an S-corp or some other form of business organization, is that it protects the individual members, owners of that business, from liability under certain circumstances. So that if you were to be in an unfortunate situation of looking at an infringement or any kind of other legal dispute, that your personal assets are not at risk, and it's only the assets of the business. There's a lot of tax implications with doing something like that, and so I would say to any of your listeners, definitely talk to your tax professional about the various advantages and disadvantages of forming a business entity. But again, the main reason to do it is to decrease your personal liability for anything that may happen in connection with the business.
I think you raise an interesting point, Mark, because I think a lot of people are used to thinking about, should I create my blog as an LLC or an S corp for the tax benefits, but not too often, from the personal liability perspective. Like it does add that layer of protection that at least your personal assets are not at danger or at risk.
Right, and when you do form a business entity, there are some requirements that go along with that. Going forward, you have to adhere to whatever the requirements are in your state. And it could be that you keep corporate minutes, that you're making annual filings with the Secretary of State, whatever it is, and all of that varies state to state. And so that's why it's if you are looking at doing something like that, it is important to talk to an attorney to see, well, is this something I can really keep up? And
right.
does this make sense for me, or is this more of a hassle than it's worth?
But a lot of states seems like they have made that process a little bit easier. Like you can file those documents online, and it seems makes it easier. You
certainly don't have to be an attorney to file your articles of incorporation or your LLC formation documents, but knowing that you're filing the correct ones and that you're you're doing it the right way. Particularly, we would want to have you do a trademark search before you file for that name, because again, just because the Secretary of State says you can use the name doesn't mean that it's available as a trademark.
Very good point. I also noticed that you specialize in e-commerce, and there are a lot of bloggers out there that are creating products and selling them online. Either maybe it's their own cookbooks, or it's a food photography course, or things like that. Do you see any common legal implications of doing business online?
Yeah, the most basic is some states, California, for example, requires if you're taking in information, and it may not even be from a commercial context, that you're allowing readers to subscribe to your blog, for example, and you're collecting their email addresses. How you treat that information needs to be disclosed in a privacy policy. And similarly, if you're doing any kind of e-commerce, telling people what you're doing with the information that you're collecting needs to be set forth in your privacy policy, and your terms of use need to spell out, okay, well, here's, what if there's a dispute? What if you claim that you didn't get the product that I shipped you? If you're doing all of that yourself, the terms of use are very important. So it's like any other business relationship. The customer and the supplier or the business need to have an understanding of what's the nature of this transaction, and what are people's rights and responsibilities.
Oh, that's very good, and especially as from this like small business perspective, what are you doing to protect the privacy of your customers?
Right.
Excellent.
And it's not that there's any magic as to what that privacy policy needs to say, other than what information are you collecting and what are you doing with it. That's the extent and the intent of a privacy policy is to inform your reader, how is this for your customer, how is this information that you're collecting from me being used? And you want to make sure that you're clear about it. You may say, well, I'm never going to share your information with anyone else. That technically might not be true, depending on what services you're using. Maybe that information is being aggregated by one of your service providers, or maybe you're collecting, not personal information, but maybe they're collecting IP addresses. So being very, very clear as to how, what services you're using, what third parties, and how any information that's being collected, through your blog, it may be from your ISP, it may be from some other third-party service provider, how they're using the information. And so you simply address that by saying, we're not going to sell your information. It may be, aggregated. There may be use of cookies. There may be, whatever it is. As long as you're accurate about it in your privacy policy, you're fine.
Oh, great. Mark, this has been really informative. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but I thought it'd be good to, contain it on these topics. But you're not off the hook yet, because I have a series of fun questions I like to ask at the end of the interview.
Certainly.
Okay, and I know that you're a foodie, so this is really appropriate.
Excellent.
What's the one food item you cannot live without?
Oh, in the last several years, I've got into curing and smoking my own bacon, and I don't eat it a lot, but it's really hard to go back to commercial bacon after you've done your own, so I'm going to go with homemade bacon.
I think that's so true about most things. The more that you go into making your own, it just tastes so much better than anything that you could buy at the store.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so do you have any kind of favorite online resource?
Oh, wow. There's so many. I love some of the blogs that I really enjoy. Simply Recipes, Hunter, Angler, Gardener, Cook, Leeds Culinaria, and then getting into some of the online magazines, Fine Cooking, Cooks Illustrated, all of them great resources.
You really are a foodie. I like that. Okay, so what's the first thing you look at on your phone in the morning, your favorite app?
Well, given the nature of my business, the first thing I need to look at is my email, unfortunately.
Yeah.
As to see if any clients have issues, but also for the blogs that I subscribe to, I like to see what new recipes have been posted and whether that's something I want to look at making that night or maybe on the weekend.
I was going to say, if you were to answer that by saying Instagram, I was going to say you need to start your own blog now.
I have been accused by friends of saying that my Facebook feed is simply a food blog because it's constantly just filled with stuff that I'm cooking or shares of recipes and things.
Like a food blog wannabe. Okay.
Exactly.
Cilantro or not cilantro?
Love cilantro.
Ah, that's good. Me too. But I know there's some people who they do not like it.
Well, it's funny. From what I understand, it's actually they're determining that it might be genetic related, and that your taste buds just don't respond to those chemicals that they do for people like us that really enjoy it, and it really does taste like soap. It may be like
gold and white dresses, right? Some people just see it differently.
Exactly. Yes, this is not a new debate for the foodie world. This whole the dress question is the long-standing cilantro question.
Yeah, exactly. It's the new cilantro. So, Mark, how can people find you online?
My website is davisandleonard.com, and is spelled out. And we have a number of articles there on our blog about different aspects of intellectual property generally for small businesses, certainly applicable to bloggers. And my contact information is on the website as well.
Don't you do some blogging for another site as well?
Occasionally I will do guest posts. I have an FTC article up on PR Newswire.
Great. I'll leave a link to that on the show notes page.
Great.
Wonderful. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
No problem. Enjoyed it, Marley. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much to Mark Leonard for being my guest on today's episode of the CHOP Podcast. I hope you found something inspiring from today's show. If you did, just head on over to chopcon.com, where I put up links for each show, including the stuff we talked about today and more information about our guests. If you like the CHOP Podcast, here's a couple of ways you can share the love. Leave a review on iTunes. That helps the show get more traction. Also, our goal is to spread the word. So if today's show spoke to you in some way and you want to share it with a friend, please do. That friend-to-friend referral means so much. You inspire me, so I hope today's show was helpful and inspirational to you as well. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.